So thank you, Brother Richard, for sitting down once again for Behind the Final Call cover story. Of course, this is the volume 38, number 22, with March 5th on the paper as the date. The title of this article is America Race Warrior, Arrest of Coast Guardmen accused of planning deadly attack against blacks, and others raise ugly specters of U.S. military personnel planning and mounting a racial holy war. A lot going on, but why this particular cover story?
Well, this, we thought this story was important. In particular, Christopher Hassan, a white man, a Coast Guard lieutenant, was arrested on federal charges and has been called a domestic terrorist by prosecutors. So here was a man that was serving in the Coast Guard. He had a cache of weapons, 1,000 rounds or so of ammunition, and was talking about mounting a racial holy war against blacks and others, some politicians, some media members. And it was interesting to me that this story came up as there was so much talk about the Jussie Smollett situation in Chicago and the alleged racial attacks hoax, which dominated news coverage. This story kind of came and went, but we felt that this was a pretty important story, and here's why. Not just because of what this man was accused of, but because of the history of former U.S. servicemen who are white supremacists and their attacks on American soil. For example, we had the, did you know, I'll tell you what, can you tell me, before 9/11, can you tell me what was the largest domestic terror attack in history on U.S. soil before 9/11? Just anything come to mind.
My guess is to the Black Wall Street?
No. It was the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19th, 1995. This was the bombing of this federal building by Timothy McVeigh, right, former U.S. serviceman, and Terry Nichols. Now, more than 600 people were injured and 168 people were killed. Former U.S. servicemen, white supremacists. So these people not only have a philosophy, they have a history of acting in accord with their philosophy. Do you remember anything about the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta?
Yes, vaguely.
Vaguely. What do you remember vaguely?
That there was, somebody got caught with a bag or something. There was a bag or that exploded.
After a bombing. Right. Centennial Park. This was July 27th, 1996 at Atlanta's Centennial Park. And that bombing, the man who was convicted of that was Eric Robert Rudolph, another former Army soldier and white supremacist. And that bombing in Atlanta killed one person and wounded 111 others. So here you have people not just with the philosophy, but with training and a history of acting. Now, there are really a lot of different aspects to this story. But one of the aspects that I thought was troubling is very often the federal authorities have not really faced up to this problem. They haven't dealt with this problem. For example, there was a study that was done, and it pointed out this problem of recruitment, this problem of white supremacists, this problem of these violent individuals who are seeking to launch a racial holy war in America. Now, there was a 2008 FBI assessment called White Supremacist Recruitment of Military Personnel Since 9/11. And it found a little over 200 identifiable neo-Nazis with military training, right? So this report was warning against this recruitment, this training, and in instances, some of these white supremacist groups said they sent people into the military to get this training. So Daryl Johnson was the security analyst for the Department of Homeland Security who authored this report. Guess what happened? When the report was issued, it was condemned. It was condemned by right-wing folks, it was condemned by conservatives, it was condemned by white lawmakers who said you're casting a net on, and you're painting white people, white men, with this brush of terrorism, and it's wrong. So what ended up happening was the report was basically quashed. This was under, of course, President Obama. So what we have seen historically is this problem. Whenever there's talk, I don't know if you remember the whole militia movement, 90s, 80s, 90s, this whole white militia movement. And these are people in many cases that are talking about the violent overthrow of the American government. This is their aim. They have robbed banks, they have fought and killed federal law enforcement officials as well. So this is a long-standing problem, and we wanted to draw attention to it because we are taught that as you see the continued disintegration of American society, you will see this rising level of violence. So this is a very important story. We didn't want to get caught up in the hype of Jussie Smollett and this all the talk about this alleged crime, race crime in Chicago. And this was important. And it's something that we need to be aware of. And whenever a story comes up that others ignore, we try to bring it to the attention of our people when it is an important story. And this one, we think it really is important.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. So, of course, there's still coverage of Savior's Day in the paper, and there's other things that are going on in the world today. One of those being the time of Acosta to resign. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Alexander Acosta is the U.S. Labor Secretary appointed by President Trump. Guess what he was before then? I guess we're playing 20 questions, so I ask you to guess, and you guess or don't guess. So, guess. Any guess?
No guess. No guess. Okay. Not on this one.
Well, he's a former federal prosecutor, right? This is a case out of Florida. And a judge has ruled that victims of a billionaire and Trump associate Jeffrey Epstein, a judge found that Mr. Acosta, then as a federal prosecutor and others. Now, this man Epstein was accused of basically molesting and in some ways even almost trafficking in young girls for high-profile people. He got a sweetheart deal from Mr. Acosta and others. He served a year in county jail, and that was all. A federal judge looked at this and said that Mr. Acosta and others violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act because they brokered a deal with Mr. Epstein. Again, this is a billionaire in Florida, very well connected. They brokered a plea deal with him that allowed him to serve only 13 months in a county jail for his crimes, and then they sealed up the agreement so you and I can't even see it, right? So the judge ruled that they violated the rights of these young women to speak in court and to be part of how this case was, in a sense, adjudicated or settled, because they were the victims and they should have been included in this. So the judge made the ruling February 21st, and Mr. Epstein's victims and the U.S. government have from February 15 days from February 21st to come up with a resolution. So we'll be following up on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Of course, more in little international news, a lot has been going on with Venezuela.
Yes.
And of course, there's a lot going on. Can you kind of talk about what's in the paper, but anything else that may not have necessarily made it this edition as
well. If you've been watching the news, you know that in Venezuela there's been these reports of unrest, people going hungry, civil strife, and clashes between the government of Mr. Maduro, who is the president. But the U.S. has decided that they are backing a different person because they're saying that Juan Guaido, who lost an election, right, in Venezuela, the U.S. is saying there was problems with the election. So they have decided that this man is the person that they are saying is the president. Now, can you imagine if China would have said, you remember the election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and it came down to Florida. Bush's brother was governor, and Gore won the popular vote. So now it hinged on Florida. Can you imagine if China would have said, we're going to back Al Gore, we're going to declare him to be the president, we're going to institute sanctions against the U.S., and we're going to support him because we feel that he's the legitimate president of the United States. It's absurd, but this is what is happening in Venezuela. The Trump administration has also made some statements about even possible military intervention in Venezuela. So you had Code Pink interrupted an event in Washington by a man who is representing Mr. Guaido in Washington, D.C., and pointing out that this is really another coup in the U.S. taking over a country. And we know, of course, that Venezuela has pretty huge oil reserves. So, again, we see the U.S. continuing to meddle, continuing to get involved in the affairs of other nations, and always seemingly, talking about military action. So we need to watch Venezuela and see how this thing turns out.
On the same note of war and military action, of course, there's an article titled International News, once again, Cold War is good for business. Of course, we know that this country would never be involved with military action just for financial benefit.
No. But even if it wouldn't do that, it would be involved in arms trading. And it would be involved in purchasing arms, as it talks about the threat with Russia, even though the president denies that it's a threat. But what the article is basically talking about is the U.S. had a military budget of $717 billion with a B. $717 billion in 2019, which is 4 times the budget for China and 15 times larger than Russia's budget. But what it does is, of course, it puts military contractors, it puts lobbyists into a position to make money. So this is, again, these tensions with Russia, these tensions with others, become justifications for spending money that could go for domestic programs, that could go for education, that could go for curbing the national debt. That money now being spent on arms. So it is kind of par for the course. Now the interesting thing is that President Trump, is calling for the Space Force. The Space Force. And according to this article, in 2018, Lockheed Martin was contracted to create 3 satellites that can survive counter-space weaponry. Imagine that. For $2.9 billion. So there's some things that never seem to suffer regardless, in particular under Republican administrations. Military spending is one of them, because very often the contractors and the companies, they spread their operations out over several states. So if you spread your operations out over many states, then you get the support of many lawmakers because they want those jobs, they want those contracts, they want that money to be in their state. So this is again part of what we see with America's focus. Her focus on weaponry, her focus on war, her focus on the development of arms versus the development of people. And it just continues to grow, and we'll see how it turns out. Right now, the president is on the cusp, as we record, of meeting with the leader of North Korea. So we'll see how that turns out. And we should keep our eye on international affairs. We should be watching what's going on in the world. I mean, even if you watch a little bit of the Real Housewives of Atlanta or Love and Hip Hop, we all need a little distraction. But we don't need to be so distracted that we don't know what's going on in the world. So we need to pay attention to everything and enjoy a little bit of entertainment. But I don't think it's wise that we major in entertainment. It should be a diversion when we need something to take us away from the serious things of life that we deal with.
Yes. So I noticed there's actually a few articles that deal once again with international news, but Africa is discussed. Can you talk about a few of those?
Well, we have one. The UK government during World War II basically conscripted African soldiers from their colonies and forced them to fight. But it didn't pay them the same thing that it paid white soldiers. Even if they were fighting in the same theater of war, sometimes African soldiers received either 1/3 of what whites were given, sometimes 1/2 of what whites were given. Soldiers say they were beaten, they suffered corporal punishment, even though corporal punishment had been outlawed in the British military. So now they are fighting in the United Kingdom to get payment as well as an apology. So we see that this global struggle, wherever we see black people, we see this continued exploitation of us by the former colonizers or the former slave masters. Then in Africa, in Zimbabwe, as well as in Liberia, we've had people in these mines, which is not necessarily the huge mining, but it's gold, diamond, and other mines, which are essentially almost like underground pits. And people go and they try to eke out a living by getting these precious stones. And unfortunately, these subsistence miners, some of them have been trapped underground when walls have collapsed. So this was in mid-February. So we got some reporting on that, which I think is pretty interesting. And we need to be aware of what's happening, and we need to be aware of the conditions that our people face, because we believe that a good partnership between Black America and Africa can be helpful for both. The Muhammad Speaks newspaper, published by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, there was the two brothers embracing hands from Africa to Asia, embracing over America. So that kind of vision, that Pan-Africanist vision, is one that's really needed today, and it's one that we can fulfill today. But it starts with us being informed, taking some interest in what's happening. Also, Africa is ripe for business, is ripe for development. We had an article a couple weeks ago about in Ghana, where black folks are being invited to return, since this is marking the 400 year of our arrival in Johnstown in 1619. But we are taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that we actually, our forefathers and ancestors actually came here in 1555. So there's something about that 400 year period that means something, and we see it in the Bible. And now we're being invited back, whether we do business, whether we live, whether we go back and forth. So there's a lot going on in the motherland, and we should be paying attention.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And of course, I have to say, even though we have been saying Happy Savior's Day for a few days now, this is actually the true birth anniversary, and marks the birth anniversary of Master Fard Muhammad. So Happy Savior's Day to you.
Thank you, sir. And February 26th, Happy Savior's Day to you.
And there has been more coverage, of course, on Savior's Day. the graduation, the drill competition, several things that have occurred. And of course, we can't miss the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what happened in the coverage of Savior's Day, of course, in this edition of the paper.
Well, I mean, again, we had a great weekend last weekend, our annual convention, which is Savior's Day. It was the 15th through the 17th. Of course, we couldn't cram everything in the last week's edition. So this week, you can look forward to coverage of the graduation, the Nation of Islam annual graduation, those who have come officially registered in the nation, great FOI class, the men's meeting, great MGT class, the women's meeting, as well as additional workshops, as well as social events like the testimony play and a special screening of Say Brother, which tells the story of some of the ministers' work in New York City, and others, the farming workshop, education workshop that you were part of, and others. It's all here in the Final Call. So we need to come on and get your copy, go online, read it there, subscribe to the Final Call, get your digital edition so you don't miss a beat, or get your edition from one of the brothers in your local city and get it every week. You don't want to miss it.
Now, I know what you're probably anxious to get to.
Me?
And I can't be mad at you, of course. We always want to be ready and prepared to defend the man that we know and love and that has had an impact on us in the way that our lives are today. And I was reflecting on that just yesterday, just thinking about, what my life personally would be without the minister, and the lives of many others, and just that ripple effect on just how many lives he's touched directly and indirectly.
Absolutely.
And of course, so with those things, and when you reflect on that, you have to definitely think that he's definitely one who's worthy to be defended in the midst of all the attacks. So what you got for us?
Well, we have a couple articles this week. One is a perspective that I'm not going to get into because I really want you to read it. But this is by Sister Alverta and Muhammad. And I'm just going to read the first part. But you gotta check this out. She's writing this herself. She says, and this is entitled, A Personal Defense of Minister Louis Farrakhan. This is our perspective for this week. She writes, my mother, this is Sister Alverta, member of the Nation of Islam, pioneer. My mother was a Caucasian Jewish woman of Russian descent. When as a young girl, I first heard the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad under Minister Malcolm X in New York City, and heard him teach that the white man is the devil, I had had enough experiences in my young life to know that that was absolutely the truth. And this was without knowing my history as a descendant of slaves and beyond. This is Sister Alverta writing. She goes on, most of my friends and acquaintances at that time were Caucasian. So I proceeded in my newly converted zeal to go to each one and inform them that I had learned who they really were and that I would no longer associate with them, including my mother. You got to read the rest of it to see how this thing turns out. But it turns out beautifully. And this is her testimony. And she talks about the minister's impact at a certain point when he heard about years later. Now remember, this happens under Minister Malcolm X, so this is in the 60s. You need to get the Final Call to see how this story turns out. I'm not going to tell you. But get it.
I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't get to that one. But you definitely got me.
Man,
you got me intrigued.
You gotta read this one. You gotta read this one. So, lastly, my editorial. The headline is "Stop Trying to Link Farrakhan to Your Wicked Murder." So, I mean, and to try to make this simple, we know that in 1984, Reverend Jesse Jackson was running for president. And we know that at that time he called for a balanced U.S. policy in the Middle East. And we know that when he did that, there was a huge response from the Jewish community. We know that that response was even inflamed more because, again, this is the 80s and you're talking about someone calling for a balanced policy in the Middle East. That would mean that U.S. policy would no longer be tilted basically solely toward Israel. Reverend Jackson makes that declaration in 1984. He is talking to a reporter off the record and he talks about Jewish power in New York. And he talks about, he makes a remark going to Hymetown. And Jewish people took that as an insult and they came after him. There were threats and he was condemned in the media, condemned everywhere. They actually came out with advertisements saying, "Ruin Jesse, ruin," when black folk were chanting, "Run Jesse, run." So a pretty tense time. You had extremist groups like the Jewish Defense Organization that were prone to violence. So in the midst of this incredibly dangerous time, Minister Farrakhan speaks and defends Reverend Jackson. He doesn't threaten anybody. He just says very boldly, if you have a problem with Reverend Jackson, you need to meet with him. We can afford to lose an election. We cannot afford to lose our brother. And then he talks about black people being tired of feeding their leaders to white people like feeding raw meat to animals. Right? For those remarks, he was called the new black Hitler. I mean, now imagine that. So here's a man defending his brother, and you associate him with a mass murderer, talking about the Jewish leaders and groups. Well, why did you do that? You wanted to associate him with the worst character in your history. And you hope that that association would lead to his widespread condemnation and ultimately his destruction. So this attempt to link the minister with these white murderers, not to mention that this man Hitler killed black and mixed race people in Germany. Not only that, but in Southwest Africa at the time, which is now known as Namibia, 2 ethnic groups were almost exterminated by the Nazis. In addition to that, the Italians, who were allies of the Nazis, gassed our people in Ethiopia. So in terms of that, we go back to the minister's initial statement when this thing arose: don't compare me with your wicked murderers. But wait, there's more. In 2019, we have another instance in which these Jewish and Zionist folks want to connect the minister with someone who is associated with murder, the extermination of the Palestinian people, and is tied to Israeli politics. Now, you would have to ask the question, where's the minister when it comes to politics in Israel? Well, essentially, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is trying to stay in office. He has now invited 2 political parties in Israel that are seen as extreme to become part of his government. Others in Israel have condemned his decision, but the way that they framed it is, if you condemned Farrakhan and Tamika Mallory of the Women's March, right, the leader of the Women's March, you must condemn Benjamin Netanyahu for embracing these far-right Jewish groups. Wait a minute. What does Minister Farrakhan and Tamika Mallory have to do with political parties in Israel on the extreme? It's really important to me because one of these parties is tied historically to the Jewish radical and terrorist Rabbi Meir Kahane, who is dead. But one of his followers, on February 25th, 1994, entered the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron in Israel. With an assault rifle, he killed 29 people and injured 125 more. Ultimately, those who survived his attack beat him to death. So when you were talking about putting the minister's name even in the same sentence with the political party linked to this man as its root, linked to disciples of this man, you are now once again trying to associate him with killers and murderers and destroyers. See, we can't have that. We've got to see that, and we've got to call these people out, and we've got to demand that they stop it. But even more important than that, and the way that I close the editorial is, black folk, what are you going to do? Because you know Minister Farrakhan. We don't expect the enemy to change. We've already called them out for a showdown. They haven't showed up yet. The question is, black folk, you know Minister Farrakhan. He's taught at colleges. He's taught at churches. He's taught in prisons. He's taught on TV. He's taught on radio. I was blessed to be with him and walk the campus of Winston-Salem State University a few years ago. And just in that one day and a few hours, he ran into 3 or 4 generations of people he had taught. This is just literally on one campus, 3 or 4 generations. So black America, you know Minister Farrakhan, you know the Muslims, you know that we're trying to help you stop your sons from killing each other. You know we're trying to stop your daughters from being disrespected. You know we're trying to reform criminals and be in places like this, the foodie spot located right here on Stony Island Avenue, right? At 7350 South Stony Island Avenue right now. We are working 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 right now in loud places like this, where people come in full of the spirit of being in a black establishment where they can feel some love, even if they're a little loud, but you know how black people are anyway. But we are engaged in productive activity. We are engaged in our own way in trying to rebuild wasted areas, not waiting for someone else to do for us what we can and must do for ourselves. That's our history. I got a new book out, Dope Busters, Farrakhan Fanatics or Saviors, which tells some of the story of the Muslim anti-drug patrols in Washington, D.C. in 1988 in the middle of the crack cocaine epidemic. We are the ones that service your family members in prison. That's us. When there's a problem, we're the ones that you call. So when you see us around people like the mother of Trayvon Martin, when you see us around the family of people like Stephon Clark, when you see us around people like Mike Brown, when you see us around these different black folks that have suffered, we have been called to stand with them. We don't force ourselves into anywhere. So my point is, Jewish people have decided they're going to pursue their interests. And they have decided it is in their interest to destroy Minister Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. So the question becomes, black America, what are you going to do? Are you going to let that happen? Are you going to stand by? Or are you going to rise up and just speak the truth of what you know about the Muslims, what you know about the nation? And are you going to continue to support the nation? Are you going to call out politicians that allow themselves to be manipulated and forced to repudiate a man who hasn't done anything to anybody? It's kind of like Jesus being crucified. You'd have to ask the question, for which one of his good works do you condemn him? So that's the question. We're going to fight the enemy. They're going to fight us. Ultimately, we're going to win. But we say to black folks, it's time to pick a side. And we hope that you would pick a side, pick the side of a man who has served you for over 60 years, 64, 65 years? Or are you just going to let it go? So anyway, it's getting loud in here. Welcome to the foodie spot, 7350 South Stony Island Avenue. Come on down and get yourself some food and enjoy good company.
Yes.
And I guess we done for the day. Because
It's-
can't nobody hear us anyway at this point.
Right. But thank you once again. For those who want to get that book, where exactly can they go to do that?
Well, you can get me on social media, Twitter, and you can find me on Facebook, or you can go to richardmuhammad.com. The book is $20 plus $8 shipping and handling. We can do PayPal, we can do Cash App, and you can actually text me 312-480-9775. And we think it's a good book. We think it's a good story, and we think it's important history in particular, as we're still in Black History Month, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Few more days.
We need some history, some real history of black men in a heroic mode, as opposed to the misportrayal. And so this is a true story. It's reality. I think it's a great story. So get your book and let me know what you think.
Thank you, Brother Richard. As you said, we are here at 7350 South Stony Island at the foodie spot with good food for your soul and good camaraderie with black people who are concerned about the condition of our people. So until next time, Behind the Final Call cover story, follow The Final Call on all social media platforms and visit thecollective9.org's website. Until next time. Oh, and we can't leave this episode without reminding people that this is a big celebration this year.
Absolutely.
It's the 40th anniversary of the Final Call newspaper. Be on the lookout for a lot of updates, a lot of things going on. And support that.
All right.
Peace until the next time. Assalamu alaikum.
But I made one with some paper sauce.